Britain has bid farewell to Queen Elizabeth II with a historic state funeral.
The Queen's funeral has seen the biggest ever gathering of senior dignitaries with more than 500 kings, queens, prime ministers and presidents.
6 nations have missed the cut: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Belarus, Myanmar and Russia.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II this week marked the end of an era, and not just for the United Kingdom. The incredibly grand and flawless farewell to the Queen was watched by an estimated 4 billion people around the world, making it one of the biggest televised events ever. It's also said to have been one of the biggest gatherings of world leaders, royalty and other dignitaries in history. It's even been compared to the funerals of Pope John Paul II and Nelson Mandela. As you can imagine, organising such events with so many VIPs is fraught with diplomatic difficulties and risks. Thank goodness nothing went wrong at the Queen's funeral, but there were a few tensions and hurt feelings along the way.
The abbey that married her, the abbey where she was crowned, waits to receive this gentle Christian soul.
It was a respectful and sombre affair, but as diplomatic occasions go, they don't come much bigger than the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Over 500 foreign dignitaries, including around 100 heads of state, came to London to pay their respects and play some politics. Even on an occasion like this, there's still time for some diplomatic point scoring. The guest list itself was like a one-stop guide to current geopolitical tensions. 6 countries were deemed so diplomatically toxic they didn't get an invite of any kind: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Belarus, Myanmar, and of course Russia. Moscow's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called the lack of an invite for Russia blasphemous against the Queen's memory. Of course, Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenskaya, was in attendance and got a well-publicised meeting with the new Princess of Wales. Iran, North Korea and Nicaragua just about made the cut, but were only allowed to send ambassadors. Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler Mohammed bin Salman was invited, which raised complaints from human rights activists, but he decided not to attend, which may have saved embarrassment, even though the Saudi royal family has been close to the British royal family for many years. Despite rocky relations, China's President Xi Jinping was invited to attend, but sent his vice president instead. It was certainly a bit awkward when Beijing was originally told that sanctions meant its representatives could not enter the British Parliament to see the Queen's coffin. In the end, though, they were allowed to pay their respects and even bring their own car. Which was a big diplomatic deal for China, because with London facing one of the biggest security challenges ever, with few exceptions, planners had asked leaders and royalty used to travelling in the finest corteges to catch buses to Westminster Abbey. Some Gulf Arab leaders were reportedly so offended they declined to attend, although most others were happy to pitch in, like the Kenyan president. Of course, the American president, Joe Biden, didn't have to join the hoi polloi on the coaches. He was given the honour of being allowed to use his own car, nicknamed the Beast. Biden may have got special treatment, but he still cancelled his first full meeting at Downing Street with the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. The Americans promised to hold it at the UN General Assembly and made good on that promise, but it was still being interpreted by some as a snub for Truss. Now, while Biden may have been worried about his security, contrast that with the French president, who went for a different approach. Emmanuel Macron was spotted walking around London. Perhaps to make up for the recent tensions with the British Prime Minister, he took extra care to express his solidarity with the British and his affection for the late Queen, even posting a thoughtful video on social media of the Queen and former French leaders.
Monsieur le Président, puisse la confiance et la compréhension mutuelle entre la République française et le Royaume-Uni durer toujours.
Canada's leader, Justin Trudeau, spoke of the Queen being one of his favourite people. and yet he still found time, amongst the sadness, for some karaoke at his hotel in London. That may have been insensitive of Mr. Trudeau, but the prize for most blatant use of a political opportunity may well go to Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro. He was mobbed on his arrival and gave a campaign speech from the balcony of Brazil's embassy in London. It seems that when it comes to the cynical world of international politics, even a funeral is an opportunity. We're going to get into all of that in a moment with our guests who come from all four corners of the world. Andre Walker, well, he's a journalist in London down the road. He covered the funeral for various news outlets. We'll also be hearing from Dasha Chernyshova, who is our correspondent in Moscow. Also joining us is a Chinese-American researcher at a leading Chinese think tank, Andy Mok, who will be giving us the view from Beijing. And finally, in Calgary, we have Stockwell Day, a prominent conservative voice in Canada who used to lead the official opposition there. We'll hear from all of them in a moment. But first, let's hear from the public. And this week, we sent our producer to central London to see what people there made of the global spectacle of the Queen's funeral.
Putin wasn't invited to the funeral of the Queen. What do you think about that?
I think that was the right decision. Politically, he's been ostracised, and I think that's the way it should stay.
I think that's a pity. I think we need to promote global peace, not dissension. I doubt he'd have come, you know, but I just think it would have been a good gesture to make it all inclusive.
You're American, and President Biden came in an entourage of motorcades rather than the buses provided. What do you make of that?
I think it probably had all to do with security, you know, protection, his Secret Service. He probably himself had no choice in the matter, would be my guess.
Because of the scale of the Queen's funeral and many world leaders attending, what does it say about Britain's place on the international stage?
I think it might have won a bit of a space back, having been slipping down quite a poor state. I think it's those last grasp at being an important country, and they did it well. But it's a shame that that's the only thing they can do well.
Okay, let's get to our guest now. Andre Walker, friend of the show, we're going to come to you first. Picking up on what that last lady in the Vox Pops had to say, she said, you know, at least Britain can still put on a very grand show. To what extent does that soft power, you know, how important is that to Britain's status in the world?
Well, I think it's interesting that some people think it's disparaging to say that this is a show of force, but I think it is important for the United Kingdom to recognise that whilst this was a funeral, it was also an opportunity to showcase Britain. You know, there's going to be people, if you look at the President of Armenia who got a photo, will be people who will use this in re-election campaigns. There are people who really didn't care about the Queen who will have been in London for it, and I think that is important for the United Kingdom. And you know, we wouldn't be spending all of this tax money if this was only a funeral. I think you have to recognise that this was the largest gathering of world leaders in human history, and the United Kingdom has the ability to do that, and therefore we do it. Now, that may seem hard and that might seem harsh to people who are mourning in the United Kingdom, but yeah, I think Her Majesty the Queen was a rather practical person, and that projection of power is important to us.
Andre, can I ask you about a very sensitive subject, the issuing of invitations? Not everyone got one, a few very notable exceptions. To what extent is that a government decision and a royal household decision?
Yes, there were only 6 countries that were completely not invited. The ones that you're going to be really interested in are Russia and Belarus, but of course Venezuela was also on that list. Other countries were only invited at an ambassadorial level, North Korea being a notable example. But look, the reality is that most countries around the world were invited, and in terms of how invitations operate, it's always fluid. But it's run by the Cabinet Office, which is the department that the Prime Minister himself is based in. And so whilst the royal family and their private secretaries will have a role in it, it is principally a government decision, principally a diplomatic decision, principally a decision based on the governance of the United Kingdom rather than on the specific needs of the royals themselves.
The Russians were pretty upset about not receiving an invitation, and they said that it was actually a blasphemous move against the Queen's memory, because after all, she was never overtly political. But I just want to take our viewers back to around about March, I think it was, and Her Majesty the Queen was meeting Justin Trudeau. In the background of this photograph, we can see the flowers there are blue and yellow. Now, that was supposed to be, according to sources at the palace, that was actually a signal of her support for Ukraine.
Well, I mean, she was very, very good at making signals like that and then giving us the ability to deny them when she didn't want to. Look, you know something? There will be a debate about the situation with Russia and Belarus. I genuinely think the reason that Russia wasn't invited was because it would just be impossible to do it. I just don't think you can tick all the boxes. The Russian ambassador has made a number of extraordinary claims against the United Kingdom in recent months. And the idea of inviting Vladimir Putin himself, I mean, he's not legally allowed into the country anyway, but even if he was, I just don't see it happening. And so, look, it may well be that this was a deliberate diplomatic snub. I've no doubt that some people feel that way. But actually, I think there's a rather more practical reason that none of these people are appropriate to be there.
Daria, let's talk about Vladimir Putin now. He actually put out quite a heartfelt message to Prince Charles on the Kremlin website. It says here, "For many decades, Elizabeth II rightfully enjoyed the love and respect of her subjects as well as authority on the world stage. I wish you courage and perseverance in the face of this heavy, irreparable loss. I ask you to convey the words of sincere sympathy and support to the members of the royal family and all the people of Great Britain." What was Vladimir Putin trying to achieve with this message?
Well, certainly when we have heard from Vladimir Putin being one of the first international leaders sending his condolences to the United Kingdom, to King Charles over the death of Queen Elizabeth II, we've seen some sort of warmth in his words. He said it was an irreparable loss. He said that she was righteously one of the most significant figures worldwide. And he said that she enjoyed the love and the respect, not only among her subjects, but also the authority on the world stage. So this is something very important, some very warm words that appear at least to be very warm. And we have heard from the Kremlin presidential spokesperson who was saying that it's not that Queen Elizabeth had a space in the hearts of the Russians, but certainly they had deep respect to her for her wisdom. So it would appear that there was some sincerity in these words. It didn't seek to achieve anything. It was just a good move that was appropriate to be made at that time. But what happened in response was the UK trying to, as Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, trying to use this national tragedy for geopolitical purposes, because it is not the very fact that Russia was not invited, but how it was made that actually indignated and sparked this harsh reaction from the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry. That's why she was very outspoken, saying that it was blasphemous towards the memory of Queen Elizabeth II. And of course, it was an attempt to use this national tragedy for geopolitical purposes and somehow to score with Russia.
It is incredible how much the world has moved on, isn't it, Dasha, since 2003, when Vladimir Putin was afforded a state visit here. And, we just take a look at those pictures now, quite magnificent, but it was a long time ago and things have changed an awful lot. Now, as of today, Putin has actually escalated his attack on Ukraine. And at the same time, he's puzzled, or the Kremlin is puzzled, that he's not getting an invitation to the funeral. Is the Kremlin aware of the strange, incongruous demands here?
Well, I wouldn't say that the Kremlin is puzzled. We've heard the Kremlin saying that Russia, anyway, didn't have any plans to attend this funeral. And of course, as it has been mentioned before, it would have been quite weird for the Russian president to go to this funeral amid this political situation. But certainly what we are seeing is definitely a sea change in the relations between Russia and the West. Indeed, there was this visit in 2003, but there was another visit by Queen Elizabeth to Russia that was in 1994. So a lot has changed since then. But Russia is saying that it is pursuing its own interests and it is seeking to have the territorial integrity of its country. That's why it is scaling up and announcing partial military mobilization. But of course, when it comes to the relations with the UK, what we have seen is the lowest point in history, as it has been mentioned and characterized by many of the Russian officials. So it's not that Russia has been offended. Russia expected that. And probably the UK also never wanted to invite President Vladimir Putin.
Let's go over to Beijing for a second, if we can. Andy Mok, China's leader, was invited. And, you know, he, like Putin, had met the Queen on a state visit, much more recently, of course, 2015. Take a look at those pictures there. Very, very grand indeed. Now, why didn't he attend the funeral?
Well, I think certainly President Xi has a lot on his plate these days. The COVID crisis is still a major challenge. There are geopolitical challenges. Of course, the 20th Party Congress is coming up as well. So, as you know, Matthew, any leader's time is very precious and prioritization is very important. That being said, of course, he sent as his special emissary the Vice President, Wang Qishan.
You know, I was wondering if he was put off by the sanctions that both countries, the United Kingdom and China, have placed on each other. And we saw some of that playing out during the funeral, didn't we? We saw the Speaker of the House of Parliament saying that Chinese officials couldn't enter Parliament to take a look at the Queen's coffin and pay their respects. Eventually, the British gave in, didn't they? Why do you think they gave in to the Chinese demands to get in?
No, I think certainly the state of the relationship between China and the UK is one factor. And certainly, I think the UK has done itself no favors in taking a more antagonistic stance towards China. You know, there's many aspects to this relationship, but just look at one, the adoption of 5G, where the UK and its own security apparatus looked at the situation and said, we believe we can manage the risk. And yet they had to knuckle under after being harangued by an American official. And I think this certainly does hurt the relationship. That being said, I think the government recognizes, the UK government also recognizes the importance of maintaining a good relationship with China. And as you say, Vice President Wang Qishan was banned from the lying in state ceremony, but ultimately was able to go. And I think this is a very stark contrast that we can look at, in that the UK ultimately made a pragmatic choice here. And if we compare this to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, let me just quickly finish that. Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, where President Biden said, I can't do anything about this. You know, that this shows a much greater, I think, maturity and pragmatism.
Andre?
The reality is that we're not going to pretend that the Russian regime is not a criminal regime. When it was not a criminal regime, we were willing to properly engage with it. Nobody's trying to insult Russia. Nobody's trying to insult China. But what we are saying is that President Putin is a criminal. The war's going terribly badly. And in terms of China, look, the human rights abuses by the Chinese regime mean that, you know, we wouldn't want President Xi here. It was controversial in Britain to allow the government of China to send a representative. People were deeply unhappy about it. And the reason is because the government of China is a crazed, authoritarian, human rights abusing bunch of crooks. I think we're very proud to say that as a country.
In the end, Andre, the Chinese vice president was allowed, as was Joe Biden, to use his own car, not to take the buses. And doesn't that just show you that the UK is facing up to the fact that China's just too rich and too powerful to shun in any way?
Well, look, I wasn't particularly happy about those security arrangements, simply because if other world leaders had to go on the coaches, then why are we allowing the Chinese and the Americans? But ultimately, you know, it was a purely practical point to put people in the Chelsea hospital and then move them by coaches. It was just because literally 400 motorcades just weren't going to possibly fit down the streets of London. We were hypocrites, I suppose, towards people like President Macron and the Emperor of Japan, but ultimately, I'm glad things went well.
OK, let's go to Canada now and Stockwell Day. Stockwell, Justin Trudeau, unlike most world leaders, claims a special relationship with Her Majesty the Queen, a very intimate one. He said he knew her since he was a child. Of course, he has the benefit of being a former Prime Minister of Canada's son, and that would go with the upbringing, I guess. But what he did when he went back to Canada and said, you know, how much respect he had for the Queen and vice versa, does he use that relationship to have for political gain?
Well, I think it's fair to say any political leader would. You know, talking about Putin, when I was leader of the opposition, Her Majesty's opposition in Canada, I met with Putin just before actually his state visit to the UK. And it's an understatement to say that Putin is a student of history. So when he reflects in a sympathetic way relative to the Queen's passing, of course, he's tying in a past history of Russian monarchy and also the monarchy out of the UK. They have some common ties there, but of course the British monarchy evolved into, eventually over centuries, the Westminster form of parliamentary democracy, which has affected the world in a giant and a positive way. And of course, Putin's forebears led their part of the world into one of the worst and most atrocious regimes that we've seen for 70 years. And as far as the Prime Minister, he first of all, he's political, so he recognizes the huge support that Her Majesty has in Canada. I had the opportunity to meet with her twice. There's no question about what an amazing and impactful person she is. So he is going to reflect the public mood, something that a lot of people miss outside of Canada. When Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, he had Her Majesty's portrait taken down from a very prominent position in our Foreign Affairs building. And some pictures done by a Quebec artist, a very good artist, I will say, put up in her place. So, you know, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's matured over the last
you say
few
that,
years.
but I'm sorry to bring this up, a rather undiplomatic thing that happened in London. On Monday, the day of the funeral, he was giving his condolences to the royal family, paying his respects. 2 days before, on Saturday, he was pictured singing along to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody in a bar in his hotel. I mean, you tell me, is that two-faced, or is that just a world leader letting his hair down in what he thought was private?
No, it was I was actually going to get to that. It was a serious lapse of judgment, and it wasn't just like any bar. It was quite public, and people were taking pictures. He had similar problems a few years ago when he went to India on a state trip, and it became quite an embarrassment to the Liberal government, if not to Canadians. And certainly it was to Prime Minister Modi in India. So he still struggles with these areas of forgetting the position that he's representing. And I can tell you, there is no sympathy for him, belting out the lyrics and singing when he is supposed to be there reflecting the somber mood and sympathy of most Canadians. So that was a serious lapse, and it's going to cost him some.
You think so?
How great will it cost him? We don't know, but the apparent gains that he had made, because his comments for the days leading up to that in Canada were very well received, very respectful, and there was very little commentary on, it's sort of, I think it got him past that moment in 2015 when he first became Prime Minister, as I said, and he had the Queen's portrait taken down from the Foreign Affairs building. So I think this helped to get people beyond that. But this serious lapse has caused people to doubt some of the sincerity. I don't doubt on a personal side he's being sincere, but to be doing that, that is seen as a serious lapse here.
Andre Walker, just going to finish the show with this one point, which I think you can answer for us. I know you're a big fan of President Donald Trump, but he may have made a little mistake here. I mean, he looked at the video of Joe Biden being put into the 14th row behind the Polish president, and he said, if I were still in power, we would never be treated so shabbily. But there is a reason why Joe Biden was put in that seat quite far back from the front, isn't there?
Yes, and you know what? We always have a big argument about Switzerland and Liechtenstein. So the president of Switzerland always gets put behind the the Prince of Liechtenstein, because the President of Switzerland is another European head of state, whereas the Prince of Liechtenstein is another European monarch. It's just not a thing in reality. Of course, Liechtenstein is basically a province of Switzerland. The reality is these seating arrangements are based on precedents of history. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Donald Trump, I'm afraid, wouldn't have been sat on the front row.
Andre Walker, Dasha Chernyshova, Andy Mok and Stockwell Day, thank you all so much for your international perspective on what happened this week. Much appreciated. Well, thank you also at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.